Hey guys, tonight we begin with civilizable statues, and at least marble statues. It's early morning, so early that the sun hasn't even begun to glow over the fields yet. The air is cold, damp, and a little bit smoky from last night's fire that never quite went out. You're lying on a rough pile of straw that someone generously calls a bed. And before we go any further, I should probably warn you. If you were suddenly dropped into medieval peasant life like this, you probably wouldn't survive the week. Honestly, even surviving the day would be a pretty solid achievement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, along with your local time. It's always fascinating to see how many different corners of the world gather here for these slow nighttime journeys through history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake slowly, the way people tend to wake when there's no alarm clock. Only the faint grey hint of morning creeping through a tiny opening in the wall. The first thing you notice is the cold. Medieval houses, especially the homes of farmers, were not famous for their insulation. Your blanket, if it can be called that, is little more than a coarse wool cloth that smells faintly of sheep. Underneath you, the straw mattress rustles every time you move. Straw beds were actually common across medieval Europe. Farmers and labourers slept on sacks stuffed with straw or dried grass, which had to be replaced every few months before it became too damp or full of insects. And yes, insects were very much part of the sleeping arrangement. You stretch slowly, feeling the stiffness in your back and shoulders. Yesterday was a long day in the fields. Then again, every day is a long day in the fields. Outside, you can hear the faint sounds of animals beginning to stir. A rooster somewhere in the village finally decides it's time to do his job and announces the morning with dramatic enthusiasm. Chickens cluck softly. A cow shifts in the small shed beside your hut. This is your alarm clock. In the medieval world, especially between the 9th and 14th centuries, most people lived exactly like this. Historians estimate that roughly 80 to 90% of the population worked in agriculture. Kings, knights, castles and battles might dominate the history books. But the real medieval world was built on the backs of farmers just like you. And farming was exhausting. You sit up slowly, rubbing sleep from your eyes. The hut around you is smaller than most modern bedrooms. The walls are made from a mixture of wooden frames packed with clay and straw, a technique called wattle and daub. It actually worked fairly well at keeping wind out, though it did little to keep the cold away during winter. The roof above you is thatched with dried reeds and straw, which, unfortunately, means it occasionally leaks. A faint thread of smoke drifts through the room. In the center of the hut is a small fire pit where last night's cooking fire burned low. Medieval peasant homes rarely had proper chimneys at first. Smoke simply floated upward and escaped through a small hole in the roof or through the door if it happened to be open. As a result, medieval homes were often smoky inside. Over time, the soot darkened the wooden beams overhead, giving everything a permanently shadowy look. You swing your legs off the straw mattress and your feet touch the packed dirt floor. Cold, damp, real. Shoes are nearby, simple leather things that look more like soft boots than modern shoes. They're worn and slightly stiff. You pull them on slowly. Across the room, someone else stirs. Maybe it's your wife, maybe a child, maybe several children. Medieval farming families lived together in close quarters, sometimes with animals sharing the same building during winter for warmth. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. You push open the rough wooden door and step outside into the grey morning. The village around you is quiet, but waking. Small huts like yours sit scattered along a muddy path that passes for a road. Thin curls of smoke begin rising from rooftops as other families light their morning fires. The air smells like damp earth, animals, and wood smoke. In the distance, you can already see the fields, your fields, or rather the Lord's fields that you work, because one of the most important facts about medieval farming life is that most farmers did not own the land they worked on. Instead, they were part of a system historians call feudalism, where land belonged to a lord, usually a nobleman, and peasants worked that land in exchange for protection and a place to live. Historians still argue whether peasants viewed the system as purely oppressive or simply as the natural structure of society. To people living at the time, it often seemed like the normal order of the world. Still, Normal doesn't mean easy. You glance toward the eastern horizon, where the sky is slowly turning pale gold. Soon, the work begins. And the work, unfortunately, never really ends. But before heading to the fields, there's another small challenge waiting for you inside the hut: breakfast. Now, if you're imagining stacks of pancakes or warm bread fresh from a bakery, you might want to lower your expectations just a little. Medieval farmers usually started the day with something very simple, often a bowl of pottage. Pottage was a thick stew made by boiling whatever ingredients happened to be available: grains, vegetables, maybe beans, maybe a bit of onion. Sometimes, if luck had been especially generous recently, a tiny piece of meat might find its way into the pot. But most days, it didn't. And so, as the pale morning light slowly spreads across the village, and the rooster continues shouting about the sunrise like it's personally responsible for it, you turn back toward your hut, because a long day in the fields is waiting, and you're going to need whatever energy a bowl of medieval peasant breakfast can provide, which, as you'll soon discover, isn't much. You step back inside the hut, pulling the wooden door closed behind you, as the early morning chill follows you in for a moment before settling quietly outside again. The interior is still dim, lit only by the faint glow of embers in the fire pit. Medieval homes rarely had windows in the modern sense. Instead, small openings in the wall sometimes allowed light and air to pass through, though these openings were often covered with wooden shutters or cloth to keep out wind and rain. Your eyes adjust slowly to the gloom. The hut is small enough that you can see nearly everything from where you stand. A few rough wooden stools sit near the fire pit. A table made from uneven planks leans slightly to one side, and in the corner, bundles of straw and sacks of grain rest against the wall. This place is not just your home, it's your entire world. Most medieval farming families lived in structures very much like this one. Historians believe that peasant houses were usually built by the villagers themselves, using materials gathered nearby: wood from forests, clay from the soil, straw from harvested fields. Construction methods varied slightly across Europe, but the basic idea remained the same: simple, practical, and fast to build. Comfort, however, was not the priority. You notice the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air again. It clings to everything: the wooden beams, the blankets, even your clothes. Over time, medieval homes developed a kind of permanent, smoky scent. Oddly enough, this constant smoke may have had one small advantage: it helped keep insects away, which was helpful, because insects were definitely part of life here. You walk closer to the fire pit and crouch down. A small iron pot hangs above the embers. Someone must have left it here overnight. Inside is a thick mixture that has cooled into something between soup and porridge. Pottage again. Pottage was one of the most common foods in medieval Europe, especially among the poor. The ingredients depended entirely on what was available: barley, oats, cabbage, onions, beans, and sometimes peas might be boiled together slowly for hours. If meat was available, which was rare for peasants, it might be added in small pieces, but often the stew was entirely vegetable-based, and sometimes not even that. You scoop a little into a wooden bowl. The texture is thick and uneven, but the warmth spreading through the mixture as it reheats over the fire is comforting in its own quiet way. Across the room, one of the children stirs and sits up, rubbing their eyes. In medieval farming families, children quickly became part of daily labor. By the age of 7 or 8, most were already helping with small tasks: collecting firewood, feeding animals, carrying water. Childhood, as we think of it today, was much shorter. Not cruelly so, perhaps, just practically. Because survival required everyone's help. You take your first slow bite of pottage. It's plain, a little earthy, and slightly smoky from the fire. Bread might appear alongside it on good days, though medieval bread for peasants was usually dark and coarse, made from grains like rye or barley, rather than the refined wheat used by wealthier classes. There's an interesting historical detail here that historians still discuss. Bread was so important in medieval diets that different social classes often had different types of bread. Wealthier people ate soft white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. Poor farmers like you typically ate darker bread made from grains that were harder to grow but easier to process. In fact, some medieval bread included bits of husk or bran that modern bakers would carefully remove. But you eat it anyway. Because food is food. Outside, the sounds of the village grow slightly louder. A cartwheel creaks somewhere down the muddy road. A dog barks once, then twice. Someone nearby is already chopping wood. Morning has officially begun. You glance around the hut again and notice some of the smaller details that fill your daily life. A wooden bucket stands near the wall for carrying water. Water usually comes from a shared well somewhere in the village. Fetching it is a daily task, and sometimes a surprisingly social one, as villagers gather there to talk briefly before returning to work. Near the door, a bundle of tools leans against the wall. Not impressive tools, just simple wooden handles fitted with iron blades hoes, small sickles, and other farming instruments. These tools represent hours of labor, not just in the fields, but also from the local blacksmith who shaped the metal pieces. Blacksmiths were incredibly important figures in medieval villages. Without them, tools could not be repaired, horses could not be shoed, and many essential items would simply wear out. Historians often point out that the blacksmith's forge was one of the busiest places in any rural settlement. You finish the last of the pottage slowly. It fills your stomach, but doesn't make you feel especially energized. Then again, medieval farmers often burned thousands of calories a day through physical labor, so meals were less about luxury and more about steady fuel. You stand and stretch again. Your back cracks softly. The fields are waiting, but before leaving, you take one more moment to glance around the hut. This small building holds nearly everything you own. A few tools, some clothing, a handful of wooden bowls and cups. Medieval peasants owned very few possessions. In fact, some historians estimate that a typical farming family might have fewer than 50 personal items in total. Compared to modern homes filled with hundreds or thousands of objects, the difference is striking. Life here is simpler, but also much harder. Outside the door, the sky has brightened slightly. The pale gold light of sunrise spreads slowly across the fields beyond the village. Thin lines of mist hover just above the damp soil. It looks peaceful, almost beautiful, but you know better, because those fields are about to demand hours and hours of relentless work. And as you step outside once again, tightening your worn leather shoes and glancing toward the long rows of land stretching beyond the village, you realize something quietly important. The day has barely begun, and you're already tired. You step outside again, the wooden door creaking softly behind you as it closes. The village is now fully awake, though busy in the medieval countryside doesn't mean loud or chaotic, the way modern mornings might feel. Instead, everything moves slowly and steadily, like a quiet machine beginning its daily routine. A thin layer of mist still clings to the fields beyond the village. The air smells of wet soil, animals and smoke drifting from cooking fires. Somewhere nearby, a cow lets out a long, unimpressed moo, as if it too understands that another long day of work has arrived. You begin walking along the narrow dirt path that winds through the village. Your boots sink slightly into the soft ground with each step. Medieval roads, especially in rural areas, were rarely paved. Most were just dirt paths worn down by years of carts, animals, and human feet. When it rained, these roads could turn into thick mud. Today, luckily, they're only slightly damp. A few other villagers move along the same path with you. No one is in a hurry exactly, but everyone knows where they're going. A man ahead of you carries a wooden yoke across his shoulders, with 2 empty buckets hanging from it, probably heading to the village well. A woman nearby scatters grain for a group of chickens that immediately begin arguing loudly over breakfast. Village life runs on routines like these. Most medieval villages were small, often containing somewhere between 50 and 300 people. Everyone knew everyone else, sometimes for generations. Families lived side by side their entire lives, working the same fields their parents and grandparents once worked. In a way, the village is less like a neighborhood and more like a living organism. Everyone has a role, and your role is waiting out there in the fields. You leave the cluster of huts behind and follow the path toward the farmland. The land stretches outward in long, narrow strips, separated by thin, grassy borders. This arrangement might look strange at first, but it's part of a system historians call the open field system, which was common across much of medieval Europe. Instead of one farmer owning one big field, the land was divided into many small strips scattered throughout the larger area. Each farming family worked several strips in different locations. Historians still argue whether this system developed mainly for fairness or simply because land was divided repeatedly between families over generations. Either way, it meant that farmers like you spent a lot of time walking between different pieces of land. You finally reach your strip of field. The soil looks dark and heavy, still damp from recent rain. A wooden plough rests nearby where it was left yesterday evening. Beside it stands the animal that will help you pull it through the ground, a patient, slightly grumpy-looking ox. Oxen were incredibly important in medieval agriculture. While horses could also pull ploughs, oxen were often preferred by poorer farmers because they were stronger and easier to feed. They moved slowly but steadily, which actually worked well when ploughing thick soil. Your ox glances at you as if to say, "Ah, you again." You pat its side gently and begin preparing the plough. The plough itself is a fairly simple device compared to modern farming equipment. A wooden frame holds a metal blade designed to cut into the earth and turn the soil over. This process ploughing helps prepare the ground for planting by loosening the soil and burying weeds. In medieval Europe, one of the most important agricultural inventions was the heavy moldboard plough, which appeared around the early Middle Ages. This type of plough was designed specifically to handle the thick, clay-rich soils found in northern Europe. Without it, farming those regions would have been much more difficult. You grip the wooden handles of the plough while guiding the ox forward. Slowly, the blade cuts into the soil. The first line forms. It's hard work almost immediately. Your arms strain slightly as you guide the tool through the uneven ground. The ox pulls forward patiently, step by step, while the plough scrapes through roots and clumps of earth. The sound of metal against soil fills the quiet morning. Scrape, step, scrape, step. A few birds circle overhead, watching carefully. Birds often followed ploughs because freshly turned soil sometimes revealed insects or worms an easy meal. And in medieval farming, even birds had their routines. You reach the end of the row and stop briefly to catch your breath. The sun has now risen above the horizon, spreading a pale golden light across the fields. From here, you can see other farmers working their strips as well. Some guide ploughs like you. Others swing hoes or clear weeds from the edges of the land. No one talks much. There isn't really time. Medieval farming required an enormous amount of manual labor. Unlike modern farms with machines and tractors, nearly every task had to be done by hand or with simple tools, and the work never truly stopped. There's also a quiet pressure hanging over everything you do here, because these crops aren't just food, they're survival. If the harvest fails, if bad weather destroys the grain, if disease spreads through the crops, the consequences can be severe. Medieval history includes many periods of famine, when poor harvests left entire villages struggling to survive. One of the most famous examples is the Great Famine of 1315-1317, when heavy rains ruined crops across northern Europe, leading to widespread hunger and hardship. You probably don't know that exact date yet, of course, but you do understand the risk. Every furrow in the soil matters. You turn the plough again and guide the ox forward for another row. Your boots sink deeper into the earth now, your shoulders slowly growing heavier with each pass across the field. Time moves strangely out here. Minutes stretch into long, quiet stretches of work. The village behind you feels far away now. The world is just you, the ox, and the stubborn soil beneath your feet. And as the sun climbs higher into the sky, warming the misty fields around you, you realize something about medieval farming life that historians often emphasize. It's not dramatic, it's not heroic, it's simply relentless. Row after row, hour after hour, day after day, and you're only just getting started. You guide the ox forward again, the wooden plough digging slowly into the stubborn soil. As the morning sun climbs a little higher, the mist that hovered over the fields earlier is now fading away, replaced by soft golden light stretching across the farmland. From a distance, the fields might look peaceful. Up close, however, they are stubborn, uneven, and surprisingly exhausting. Your boots sink slightly with every step. The ground here is thick and heavy, the kind of soil that clings to tools and refuses to move easily. Every few minutes the plough blade catches on a root or a buried stone, forcing you to stop and yank it free. You sigh quietly. This is normal. Medieval farmers spent hours every day doing work exactly like this. And the tools they used were helpful, yes, but still incredibly basic compared to anything we would recognize today. The plough you're holding is mostly wood. The metal blade attached to the front is valuable, carefully shaped by the village blacksmith. Iron wasn't something farmers wasted. If a tool broke, It was repaired again and again until there was barely any metal left to reshape. Historians often point out that medieval tools were built to last a long time simply because replacing them was difficult and expensive. You reach the end of another row and stop for a moment. The ox snorts softly, clearly unimpressed with the entire situation. If oxen could roll their eyes, this one probably would. Interestingly, oxen were often preferred over horses for heavy farm work during the early medieval period. Horses were faster, but they required better feed and more care. Oxen, on the other hand, could survive on rough grasses and still pull enormous weight. Plus, if times became truly desperate, an ox could eventually become food. Historians sometimes mention this as one of the practical, if slightly grim, advantages of working animals in medieval villages. You turn the plough again and begin another row. Scrape, step, scrape, step. The rhythm settles into your muscles slowly. It's repetitive work, but repetition has a strange, calming effect. Your thoughts wander while your body moves almost automatically. Across the field, another farmer pauses to wipe sweat from his forehead. He raises a hand briefly in greeting before returning to his work. No long conversations happen out here. Everyone understands that daylight is precious. Farming schedules were closely tied to the seasons. Certain tasks had to happen at exactly the right time. Ploughing, planting, harvesting, each followed a natural calendar that couldn't easily be delayed. If you missed the right moment to plant grain, the harvest might fail months later. And that's a risk no farmer wanted to take. As you guide the plough again, you notice something moving in the soil behind you. Birds. Several small birds hop eagerly along the fresh furrow, pecking at insects uncovered by the plough. They follow you patiently, almost like quiet co-workers. Nature wastes nothing. In fact, medieval farmers often worked closely with natural cycles without fully understanding the science behind them. Crop rotation, for example, was one of the most important agricultural practices of the time. The three-field system, which became common during the High Middle Ages, divided farmland into three sections. One planted with winter crops like wheat or rye, another with spring crops like oats or barley, and the third left fallow to recover. This system helped maintain soil fertility and increased overall food production. Historians generally agree that the three-field system played a major role in supporting population growth across medieval Europe, although historians still argue whether farmers themselves fully understood why the system worked, or whether they simply followed traditional methods passed down through generations. Either way, it worked well enough. You pause again, leaning slightly on the wooden plough handle while catching your breath. The sun is warmer now, though the air still carries the cool freshness of early morning. From this spot in the field, you can see the village clearly. The small cluster of huts sits quietly at the edge of the farmland. Thin lines of smoke drift from a few rooftops where cooking fires continue burning. It looks peaceful from here, but you know that everyone in that village is working just as hard in their own way. Some villagers care for animals, sheep, pigs, chickens, and cows. Others tend small gardens near their homes. A few specialize in trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, or milling grain. But most, like you, spend the majority of their lives out here in the fields. Another strange historical detail comes to mind as you push the plough forward again. Medieval farmers often worked from sunrise to sunset during busy seasons, like planting and harvest. That could mean 12 to 14 hours of labor in a single day. Modern jobs might sound demanding, but compared to medieval agriculture, many would feel almost leisurely. Your shoulders begin to ache now. The wooden handles of the plough press firmly into your palms. Sweat forms along your forehead despite the mild temperature. And still, the field stretches ahead. Row after row, the work continues slowly but steadily. Occasionally, the ox pauses, chewing thoughtfully as if considering the meaning of life, or perhaps simply enjoying a quick smack of grass. You don't blame it. In a strange way, the slow rhythm of farming creates a quiet partnership between farmer, animal, and land. Each depends on the others in ways that feel almost timeless. But there's also something slightly unforgiving about it. The soil doesn't care if you're tired. The crops won't grow faster because you're exhausted, and the seasons will keep moving forward whether the work gets done or not. You finish another row and glance toward the sky again. The sun has climbed higher now, casting longer shadows across the field. Morning is passing quickly, and the hardest part of the day is still ahead. You pause at the end of another furrow, resting your hands on the wooden handles of the plough while the ox lowers its head to nibble at a stubborn patch of grass. The sun has climbed high enough now that the morning chill is gone, replaced by a slow, steady warmth that settles across the fields. Your back aches slightly. Actually, more than slightly. Ploughing sounds simple when described in history books, but the reality is that it demands constant physical effort. Every step requires balance. Every movement of the plough requires control. If the blade tilts too far to one side, the furrow becomes uneven. If the ox wanders offline, you have to guide it back again. And the rows must stay straight, not because anyone is grading your farming technique, but because straight rows make planting easier later. You take a long breath and stretch your shoulders. Across the fields, other farmers are doing exactly the same thing. Some pause briefly to drink from small leather water flasks. Others keep moving without stopping, as if trying to finish their section before the sun grows too strong. The quiet rhythm of work continues all around you. Scrape, step, scrape, step, scrape. The sounds blend together into something almost hypnotic, but even in this calm moment, a small reminder of reality sits quietly in the back of your mind. The land you're working isn't actually yours. This is one of the central realities of medieval peasant life. Most farmers were not landowners. Instead, they were bound to land controlled by a local lord, often a nobleman who lived in a nearby manor house or small castle. This system is known as manorialism, a key part of the broader feudal system. In exchange for working the lord's land and paying various taxes, peasants were allowed to live on small plots where they could grow food for themselves. Historians still argue about how restrictive this system truly was. Some peasants, called serfs, were legally tied to the land and couldn't leave without permission. Others had slightly more freedom, but still owed labor or goods to the lord. Either way, a portion of everything you produce eventually goes somewhere else. You guide the plough into another row, thinking about that quietly. A few days each week, farmers like you often had to work directly on the lord's fields rather than your own. This labor was known as corvée, and it was essentially a form of rent paid through work instead of money. And money, for most peasants, was scarce anyway. Many villages operated largely through barter. Grain might be exchanged for tools. Eggs might be traded for cloth. A chicken might be offered in exchange for repairing a fence. Coins existed, of course, but they didn't circulate as commonly in rural areas as they did in cities. You push the plough forward again, your boots pressing deep into the soil. A breeze moves gently across the field, carrying the smell of fresh earth and distant wood smoke. It's not unpleasant, just earthy and real. Nearby, a group of crows lands in the field and begins hopping along the ground, searching for worms disturbed by your ploughing. Crows were common companions to farmers throughout history, and medieval people often had strong opinions about them. Some believed crows were clever creatures, almost mysterious in their intelligence. Others considered them omens of bad luck, or even messengers of darker forces. Medieval superstition was woven deeply into everyday life. Without modern science to explain weather, illness, or strange natural events, people often turned to folklore and belief to make sense of the world. For example, some farmers believed certain planting days were luckier than others, depending on the position of the moon. Historians still debate how seriously these beliefs were taken versus how much they were simply traditions passed down through generations. You reach the end of another row and turn the plough again. The ox exhales loudly, clearly unimpressed with your ambition to continue working. You pat its side again. Almost there, you might say. Though both of you know that's probably not true, the field still stretches ahead. And then there's the matter of food. Growing crops sounds straightforward: plant seeds, wait, harvest. But medieval farming was full of uncertainties. Weather could change suddenly. Too much rain could rot crops in the ground. Too little rain could dry the soil until nothing grew. Even pests could ruin everything. Locust swarms, for instance, occasionally swept through parts of Europe and destroyed entire fields within hours. The idea of crop failure wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean hunger. Historians studying medieval records have found many references to difficult years when harvests were poor. In those times, villages had to stretch whatever food remained as far as possible. Sometimes people survived by eating foods normally ignored: wild plants, roots, even tree bark in extreme cases. You shake that thought away as you guide the plough forward again. Today, at least, the soil looks promising. Dark, moist, ready. A distant church bell rings faintly across the countryside. The sound drifts slowly over the fields, carried by the wind. Church bells were one of the few reliable ways medieval villagers measured time. Without clocks or watches, daily life was often organized around these bells, marking prayer times throughout the day. The bell fades into silence again. You wipe sweat from your forehead and glance toward the sky. The sun is now well above the horizon. Morning has quietly turned into midday, and while your stomach is already beginning to think about the next meal, the field still has plenty of work left to offer. The church bell fades into silence, leaving only the quiet sounds of the countryside behind. Your ox shifts its weight patiently while you guide the plough into another row, the blade slicing once again into the dark soil. By now, the sun sits high above the fields, the warmth settles across shoulders, and the work that felt merely tiring earlier now begins to feel properly heavy. Your arms ache slightly with every step. The wooden plough handles have rubbed your palms enough that the skin feels rough and warm. This is the moment of the day when hunger begins to whisper. You've been working for hours. Medieval farmers typically started work soon after sunrise, which means by midday the body is already running on whatever small breakfast you had earlier. That bowl of pottage now feels like a distant memory. The ox slows slightly, sensing your pause. You guide it toward the edge of the field, where a small grassy patch provides a brief resting spot. This is not a long break. Medieval farm work didn't really include scheduled lunch hours the way modern jobs might. Instead, farmers simply paused when they could, ate something quickly, and returned to work. You sit down on a low patch of grass and pull a small cloth bundle from your belt pouch. Inside is bread, dark, coarse bread made from rye and barley flour. The crust is thick, the texture dense. It's not soft like modern bakery bread, but it fills the stomach well enough. Bread like this formed the backbone of the medieval diet. In fact, historians often say that bread alone could account for half or more of a peasant's daily calories. Grain was the most reliable crop in many regions, so bread became the most consistent food source. You break off a piece and chew slowly. It's slightly sour, a little dry, but satisfying in a simple way. Beside you, the ox continues chewing grass with far greater enthusiasm. You watch the fields while eating. From this spot, you can see farmers scattered across the landscape, all working their strips in quiet concentration. The open field system spreads everyone out, but not so far that you lose sight of one another. It creates a strange mix of solitude and community. Everyone works alone, but no one is truly alone. A few birds glide lazily through the sky above the farmland. Far in the distance, a narrow dirt road curves toward another village you've probably never visited. Medieval people rarely traveled far from home unless necessary. For most villagers, the world extended only as far as they could walk within a day or two, which means the horizon you're looking at right now might be the edge of your entire known world. That thought might feel strange to a modern listener, but to you, it's simply normal. You finish the bread and dust crumbs from your hands. Before standing, you take a small drink from a wooden flask. Water from village wells was the usual choice, though sometimes farmers carried small amounts of weak ale instead. Medieval ale was far less alcoholic than modern beer, and was often safer to drink than untreated water. Some historians suggest that weak ale was common enough that even children drank it occasionally, not because medieval villages were secretly wild party zones, but because boiling the water during brewing made it cleaner. Historians still debate exactly how widespread this practice was, but records from several regions suggest it wasn't unusual. You stand again, stretching slowly. Your muscles protest slightly. The break was short, but helpful. The ox glances at you again, perhaps hoping the break might continue a little longer. No such luck. You guide it back toward the plough. Work resumes. The blade sinks into the soil once more, cutting a fresh line through the earth. The field slowly transforms behind you into neat rows of turned dirt. It's slow progress, but visible progress. And medieval farming often depended on patience like this. Planting season required steady work for weeks. Then came the long waiting period while crops grew. After that came harvest season, which historians often describe as the most intense time of the entire agricultural year. During harvest, entire villages worked together to bring in crops before bad weather could ruin them. Even children help. Grain had to be cut with sickles, gathered into bundles, dried and transported for storage. It was exhausting but absolutely necessary work. You guide the plough forward again, watching birds continue their patient following behind you. Somewhere nearby, a crow lets out a loud caw. Crows were sometimes believed to be unusually intelligent animals in medieval folklore. In fact, certain stories suggested that crows could remember human faces or even deliver messages from distant places. Historians today smile politely at such stories, though modern science has actually confirmed that crows are surprisingly smart birds, so perhaps medieval farmers were noticing something real, even if they explained it differently. You wipe your forehead again and glance at the sky. The sun has begun its slow movement toward the western side of the horizon. Afternoon has arrived. There are still many rows left to finish, but something about the steady rhythm of the work has settled your mind now. The repetitive motion of guiding the plough has become almost meditative. Step, scrape, step, scrape, step, scrape. Time moves slowly across the fields, and while the work remains exhausting, there's a strange, quiet peace in knowing exactly what the day requires from you. Nothing more, nothing less, just the land, the ox, and the endless patience of the soil beneath your feet. The afternoon sun settles heavily across the fields now, casting shorter shadows and warming the soil beneath your boots. The steady rhythm of ploughing continues, though each step feels slightly slower than the one before. Fatigue has begun to settle into your shoulders. It's not the sudden kind of exhaustion that appears all at once. Instead, it creeps in gradually, quietly, tightening your muscles, reminding you with every movement that the human body was not necessarily designed to guide a wooden plough through stubborn earth for hours at a time. Still, the work continues. Step, scrape, step, scrape. Your ox seems to understand the routine just as well as you do. It walks forward patiently, occasionally snorting or flicking its tail to chase away persistent flies. Flies, as it turns out, are everywhere. Medieval farms were full of animals: cows, pigs, chickens, sheep. And where animals live, flies tend to follow. During warm months, they formed an almost constant buzzing presence around barns and fields. You brush one away from your face as you guide the plough into another row. Across the farmland, a few farmers begin shifting their tools. Some are finishing their strips for the day, while others move to different sections of land. Because the open field system scattered each family's plots across several locations, farmers often had to travel between fields throughout the day. In other words, just when you finished one section of work, another one might be waiting somewhere else. Historians often describe medieval farming as a cycle of endless tasks rather than a neat schedule. Every season brought its own responsibilities. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Summer meant tending crops, removing weeds, repairing fences, and managing animals. Autumn meant harvesting grain before storms could ruin it. Winter offered slightly less field work, but it introduced new problems like cold weather, food shortages, and repairing tools for the next season. In other words, there was rarely a true break. You pause briefly to adjust the leather strap attached to the ox's harness. Harness technology was actually an important innovation during the Middle Ages. Earlier harness designs placed pressure on an animal's neck, limiting how much weight it could pull, but the development of the horse collar harness allowed animals, especially horses, to pull far heavier loads without choking. This invention helped improve farming efficiency across parts of Europe, although historians still argue about exactly how quickly this technology spread between regions. Some villages adopted improvements quickly, others kept using older methods for generations. Your village seems to be somewhere in the middle, practical, but not particularly innovative. You return to guiding the plough, your boots leaving deep impressions in the freshly turned soil. As the afternoon moves on, the sky begins changing color slightly. The bright white light of midday softens into warmer tones, giving the countryside a golden glow. From a distance, you hear faint laughter. A group of children runs along the far edge of the field, chasing one another. Their job earlier may have been scaring birds away from crops or helping gather small bundles of weeds. Now, for a few minutes at least, they've turned their duties into a game. Childhood in the medieval world looked different from childhood today. Children often began helping with farm tasks as young as 6 or 7 years old. By their early teens, many were already performing serious work alongside adults. But that didn't mean they never played. Games still happened, stories were still told, and laughter still echoed across villages, even in difficult times. You watched the children briefly before returning your attention to the plough. Another row finishes, another begins. The repetitive nature of this work has a strange effect on your thoughts. Your mind drifts from one idea to another without much effort. You notice small things like the way the wind ripples gently across tall grass, or how the soil changes texture in different parts of the field. Some areas are soft and dark, others feel packed and stubborn. Farmers gradually learn to read the land almost like a language. Which areas grow strong crops, which patches flood easily, which spots seem to resist everything. Medieval farmers didn't have soil chemistry tests or satellite weather forecasts. Their knowledge came entirely from observation passed down through generations. Your father probably taught you many of these lessons, and his father likely taught him. Historians studying rural records often find evidence of farming knowledge preserved through oral tradition, simple instructions repeated across decades. Plant after the last frost. Harvest before the first storm. Leave the soil resting every third year. Simple rules, but surprisingly effective. You reach the end of another furrow and pause again, leaning on the plough handle while catching your breath. The ox exhales loudly beside you, clearly sharing the same opinion about long afternoons in the field. You glance toward the village. The smoke rising from chimneys has grown thicker now. Evening meals are beginning to cook. Somewhere in the distance, another church bell rings faintly. Daylight is slowly beginning to fade. But the work isn't finished yet. There are still a few rows left, and in medieval farming, stopping early simply meant tomorrow's work would be heavier. So you guide the ox forward once more, the plough cutting another patient line into the earth. The field stretches quietly ahead, and a long medieval day continues, one slow step at a time. The afternoon light begins to soften as you guide the ox through another row of soil. The heat of midday has eased slightly, replaced by a gentle warmth that stretches across the countryside. Long shadows slowly creep across the field, quietly announcing that evening is approaching. Your body feels the difference immediately. The muscles in your shoulders ache with a dull heaviness. Your legs feel slower now, less eager to lift with each step. After hours of ploughing, even the simple act of walking begins to feel like work. Still, the field waits patiently. You push the plough forward. Scrape. Step. Scrape. Step. The soil turns over in neat lines behind you, forming rows that will soon hold seeds. It's a slow transformation, but one that medieval farmers trusted deeply. Turning the soil properly was one of the most important parts of the entire farming process. If the ground was prepared well, crops had a better chance of growing strong. If it wasn't, well, the consequences would appear months later at harvest time. You pause briefly to stretch your fingers. The wooden handles of the plough have left faint marks on your palms, and a thin layer of dust now coats your clothes. Nearby, the ox flicks its tail lazily. It's tired too. Oxen were incredibly strong animals, but they weren't machines. Farmers often had to balance how much work they asked from their animals. Overworking an ox could weaken it, and a weak ox was a serious problem. Without animals to pull ploughs or carts, farm work became dramatically harder. Historians studying medieval farming records often mention how valuable livestock truly was. An ox, cow, or horse represented not just an animal, but a key tool for survival. Losing one could change a family's entire year. You guide the ox into another row, watching the blade carve steadily into the ground. The soil here feels slightly softer, perhaps from recent rain. That's good. Rain was always a mixed blessing in medieval farming. Crops needed water, of course, but too much rain could quickly destroy fields. Without modern drainage systems, flooded soil could suffocate plants before they had time to grow. One of the most difficult weather patterns for medieval farmers was prolonged rain during planting or harvest seasons. In fact, historians often point to heavy rainfall as a major cause behind the Great Famine of 1315, when relentless storms ruined crops across large parts of Europe. Fields became waterlogged, seeds rotted, food supplies collapsed. Villages that normally survived comfortably suddenly faced shortages that lasted for years. You shake the thought away as you focus on guiding the plough. Today, at least, the weather seems kind. A gentle breeze moves across the farmland, rustling tall grasses along the edges of the field. The sound is soft and soothing, almost like the quiet whisper of waves along a shoreline. Moments like this remind you that medieval farming wasn't always miserable. They were peaceful days too, days when the weather cooperated, the soil behaved, and the world felt calm and predictable. But even peaceful days required constant attention. Your eyes scan the field carefully as you move forward. A patch of stubborn weeds has begun creeping along the edge of one strip. Weeds were a constant challenge for medieval farmers. Without chemical herbicides or modern tools, removing them required simple, repetitive labor. Pulling, cutting, digging, again and again. If weeds were ignored for too long, they could steal nutrients from crops and reduce the harvest. Historians sometimes describe medieval farming as a constant battle not against enemies, but against nature's endless competition. Plants competing with plants, insects feeding on crops, weather changing without warning, and humans trying their best to manage it all. You reach the end of another furrow and turn the plough slowly. The ox takes a deep breath, clearly aware that the end of the workday is approaching. Animals often learned these daily rhythms just as well as people did. In the distance, the village grows more active. A few figures move along the dirt paths between houses. Someone carries a bundle of firewood. Another leads a small group of goats toward a fenced enclosure. Smoke from cooking fires thickens as evening meals begin to simmer. You can almost imagine the smell. Perhaps a pot of vegetable stew bubbling slowly, maybe cabbage, onions, beans, and a little barley mixed together. Meat, however, would be rare. For most peasants, meat was an occasional luxury rather than an everyday meal. Livestock were far more valuable, alive providing milk, eggs, wool, or labor than as food. Historians studying medieval diets often note that peasants relied heavily on grains, vegetables, and legumes. Occasionally fish, occasionally cheese, and sometimes, if luck allowed, a bit of meat during festivals or special occasions. You push the plough through another line of soil. The sun is dipping lower now. Its golden light stretches across the fields, turning the freshly turned earth into deep shades of brown and bronze. The air cools slightly as evening approaches. Your ox slows its pace, sensing the approaching end of the day. And you feel it too. There are only a few rows left. Just a little more work before the long walk back to the village. You guide the plough forward once more, the blade cutting a final line through the quiet field. The land has taken your effort today, and tomorrow it will ask for more. The final furrow of the field slowly disappears behind you as the plough cuts its way through the last stretch of soil. The sun now hangs low in the sky, glowing deep orange as it begins its slow descent toward the horizon. Your shoulders feel heavy, your boots carry small clumps of dirt stuck to their soles, and the quiet exhaustion of a full day's work settles into every part of your body. Still, there's a small sense of relief as you reach the end of the row. You guide the ox to a stop and rest your hands on the plough handles for a moment, breathing slowly while looking across the field. The rows you've turned stretch behind you in long, dark lines. It isn't perfect. Some furrows wander slightly, some areas are rougher than others, but overall the work is done. For today at least. The ox exhales heavily beside you, as if agreeing that this is a very reasonable moment to stop moving. You pat its side gently before loosening the harness straps. Animals needed rest and care just like people did, and most farmers made sure their working animals were fed and sheltered properly. Without them, life would be far harder. You begin guiding the ox slowly toward the dirt path that leads back to the village. The walk home is quieter than the walk out in the morning. Your mind drifts lazily while your feet follow the familiar route. Around you, other farmers are finishing their work as well. A few figures move across nearby fields, carrying tools over their shoulders. Someone leads a cow down a narrow path toward a small wooden gate. The soft sounds of evening footsteps, animals, distant voices blend together into a calm rural symphony. This moment at the end of the workday was often one of the most peaceful parts of medieval life. The urgency of labor fades. The cool air begins to settle over the land, and the village slowly comes back to life as everyone returns home. You follow the path as it curves gently toward the cluster of small houses ahead. Smoke drifts from several chimneys, rising slowly into the darkening sky. The smell,